We are going to share with you a current research project that applies the map as a design research tool, in this case to better understand Confederate memorials in our landscape. We're interested in the way that the map can be used not just to present information, but also to challenge what we think we know about it. Maps have the power to construct reality, and we cannot presume that our reality is the same as others. The topic of Confederate memorials in general is highly contested. Many of you likely have images in your mind related to these memorials, either as markers of heritage or symbols of hate. We think the map can be a very powerful device through which we can examine our own assumptions. And through this research, our own personal perspectives related to this topic have shifted in some small and large ways.
The series of maps we're about to show you are meant to describe how we go about revealing and understanding the myriad systems that go into a complex wicked problem. In this case, our wicked problem is how historic symbols in public space, like the Confederate monuments, hold complex contextual meaning, have diverse interpretations, impact people's lived experience in those public spaces, and ultimately affect a community's well-being. We began by mapping the 2,474 memorials located across the United States using an open source data set collected by the Southern Poverty Law Center called Whose Heritage. This data set includes obvious memorials such as plaques, statues, and monuments, as well as less visible memorials such as songs, license plates, and street names. A closer look, which isolates the four most prominent types of memorials, reveals which types are most abundant, monuments and roads, and which types have been removed at greater rates, monuments and buildings. These differences speak in part to what is easiest to remove or rename. A building is much simpler to rename than a town, but also speaks to which types of memorialization we're most aware of and which ones have received the most pressure for removal. This research really opened our eyes to how widespread Confederate memorialization is, and visualized types of memorials we weren't even aware of or didn't think of as memorials, such as emblems on police uniforms, state mottos, and holidays. Then we mapped the memorial erection in historic context, because the social and political climate surrounding them is equally as important as where they were placed. We included major events underneath the erection timeline, and you can see the largest peak of memorial erection took place from 1900 to 1920. 40 to 60 years after the Civil War. Also at the height of Jim Crow segregation policies, when the KKK and other white supremacy groups were rapidly growing. A second, smaller peak happened mid-century at the same time as the Civil Rights Movement, with continued memorial erection until 2015. It's interesting to also see other little spikes, like the one in the early 2000s. Here the map raises questions about what's going on there. Are those memorials erected in reaction to legislation, an event, a growing interest in history? And we can't answer that question definitively, but the map highlights the pattern and gives us a place to start looking. At the top of the map, you can see the yellow arcs that connect a memorial's removal date to its erection date. You can see that the vast majority of monument removal has happened over the last decade. The momentum to remove monuments has been fueled by events like the 2015 Charleston Church Massacre, the 2017 Unite the Right rally, and the 2020 murder of George Floyd. If you remember from the timeline that we just showed, there was a secondary peak of memorial erection mid-century at the same time that the Civil Rights Movement was happening. And as you might have guessed, we wanted to dig deeper into what that pattern was. Here we've overlaid major civil rights events locations, shown in gray circles, and highlighted with orange dots the memorials erected during that same era. It's powerful to note when one of those orange dots directly coincides with a major civil rights events, either landing smack dab in the middle or close by. Again, the map here serves to raise more questions about the causes of those relationships. It is also important to note that the majority of monuments erected during this era were erected on public grounds such as state houses and courthouses, which again raises questions about the motivation and purpose of them.
Looking more closely at some of the voting policies noted in the timeline, this map looks geospatially at state-level poll taxes in gray, literacy tests in the hatch, and states with widespread Jim Crow segregation policies with the white outline. These were some of the most common tactics for reducing political power of minority groups used through the mid-century. In this map, you can see that these tactics were used across the US, not just in the South, but you can also see states with all three of these tactics, such as Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, also hold a majority of Confederate memorials. As a measure of how powerful these tactics were for reducing political power, Mississippi, highlighted in yellow, was the only state to have Black representation in the US Senate prior to 1967. And since there has been so much current debate about things like voter ID requirements, it made us curious to see how these decisions aligned or didn't with some of these historic voting laws. Here we map states with voter ID requirements, which are represented in the hatch, and gerrymandered districts, which are represented by the white outlines. This was particularly interesting to us because I'm sure, like many of you, I see policies like voter ID laws and think, of course, that makes sense. We don't want voter fraud. But then when we start to look at how rarely voter fraud actually occurs, the patterns of this legislation, and think about what that means for folks without ID access, which disproportionately affects the poor, the elderly, and people of color, then you start to think about the deeper implications these policies can have. Throughout our country's history, only 30 out of 50 states have ever had Black representation in the US House, and only 8 out of 50 states have ever had Black representation in the US Senate.
And our last two maps bring us to the contemporary political debate around Confederate memorials. This map highlights the 156 monuments which have been erected since 1969 in orange, a century after the Civil War. It also calls out the location of removed monuments in yellow and highlights the 7 states which have passed state-level legislation to protect memorials over the last decade. This map exposes the heated political debate happening throughout the South to preserve versus remove the remaining Confederate memorials.
And as professors do, we took this research into one of the seminars that we teach in the College of Design, which enrolls both undergraduate and graduate students. Here is an image of the exhibition the students curated at the end of the semester, an exhibition they called Oppressive Infrastructures. Each student took this same data set of the Confederate memorials and overlaid it on a social or physical system that they wished to research. The topics ranged from educational systems to incarceration systems to banks and lending systems. The student research in the course exposed other patterns of systemic inequity in each of these systems and mapped how racism manifests in the built environment. It raised questions for many about our role as designers, especially as we purport to try to do good. It revealed some of the often invisible systems that are in play that we are not always aware of, but that our professional work might reinforce. And most importantly, it pulled to the forefront a focus on the people that our designs might be affecting both positively and negatively.
Our interest in the Confederate memorials is rooted in our own personal experiences. As a white Southerner who grew up surrounded by memorials, I was able to ignore them or at least perceive them as passive markers of history. This work has challenged my own perspective and bias and privilege.
Growing up in St. Louis, there were few overt Confederate symbols, but Missouri was directly connected to Dred Scott and the Missouri Compromise, both huge decisions that prolonged the institution of slavery. St. Louis is also a notoriously segregated city, and that was very present, though not really questioned in growing up there. I'd been living in Boston before moving to Raleigh, and I was immediately aware and even shocked by the symbols that I saw all around. It made me feel uncomfortable because my background influenced me to see them as emblems of violence. But it also made me realize how present the Civil War still was for many in the South, and how little I actually knew about it. It wasn't until later, with more conversation and education, that I started to understand the complex role the memorials play in commemorating history. It's also helped me rethink my own Midwestern and New England history and start to acknowledge the racism and racist systems that were always alive and flourishing there.
Hopefully, this case study has revealed ways that historical patterns can have lasting effects and influence contemporary environments, and has demonstrated that wicked problems are complex and necessitate multidimensional research tools. We don't often think of memorialization being directly related to health and well-being, but one of the things that has been highlighted with the rise of Black Lives Matter and a continued focus on racial justice is how directly connected these symbols are to the social health of our communities, and how they can create and reinforce racially hostile environments and exacerbate community stress and anxiety.
Like most research, this project has raised more questions than it has answered, leading us to ask what other seemingly neutral yet harmful systems are in place in our built environment. Over your next few years here at NC State, maybe you'll use maps and data visualization within your disciplines to pinpoint opportunities for improvement and invent novel solutions to our most challenging wicked problems.
Thank you for your time, and come visit us over in the College of Design.